Welcome back, everyone. I'm the Bella Gamer, and we have so much to cover in Howl of the Wild. It is an insanely dense book filled pretty much to the gills with player options and new beasts and all that kind of stuff. I'm going to do my best up until the release date where everyone will get access to it who aren't subscribers to the Paizo subscription model to give you guys as much of the information as possible. So every day I'm going to cover a slightly different subject and then I'll cycle back around. So today we're going to be covering the Ancestry, the Minotaur, obviously by the thumbnail. Then we're going to cover one of the new archetypes. And then we're going to cover one of the other extra options, whether that's a class option, new item types, or the like. So I'll do my best to try to get as much out as possible, but, you know, I have to space the videos out because YouTube doesn't like when you bulk load a bunch of things. So, you know, you're going to have to be patient, but I guarantee no one is going to cover as much as this I will on this channel. So I recommend subscribing so you get to see all these videos as they come out and liking the videos so other people can get this new information as well. But let's go ahead and talk about the Minotaur. So the Minotaur is a very fascinating ancestry, and it's one that I'm a little split on. I know I'm going to get a little bit of flack for this, and that's okay, because I think it's valid either way. First of all, I do like the Minotaur. I like the idea behind them. The Minotaur is a ancestry based off of a creation myth of a man being cursed. It takes parts and pieces of the the real world Minotaur myth, though cleans it up a little bit, makes it a little less risque in some ways. Essentially, a guy builds a temple to a deity and makes it bull themed. The deity hates bulls, actually, even though the visions were a little murky and confusing and bulls were very prevalent. So he turned the man into a Minotaur, and the guy was upset, dove into the depths of the temple, the cave, the caverns beneath, and became the first Minotaur. How he came to produce more Minotaurs, who knows? It's their creation myth. But essentially, Minotaurs, as of currently, are kind of like a Frankenstein's monster style of ancestry. And what I mean by that is they're a large, powerful ancestry that is known for savagery, even though that is not the case. Minotaur are not inherently aggressive or brutish, and in fact, they're very restrictive. They know how powerful they are, and so they do their best to keep themselves in check. So they're very constantly aware of people's perception of them, and so they try to be better than what people expect of them. They're also a subterranean stonemason-esque ancestry, probably even better stonemasons than dwarves themselves, who kind of split themselves amongst forging and other types of crafting. Minotaurs are very, crafty when it comes to stonemasonry. They tend to be subterranean, and they also have a knack for problem solving. So that's kind of the core of what the Minotaurs are. And the book really enforces this kind of idea that Minotaurs are constantly keeping themselves in check, afraid of hurting others, and they don't want to be perceived as monsters. Now, I think that's well and good, and I think the Minotaur are very interesting. The way they're very spiritual. They also like to craft things more as an art than a necessity. So many Minotaur villages will have extra buildings that are just there because they were just bored and they decided to make another one. They're very interesting indeed. I also love the idea of the Minotaur, obviously by the image you guys are seeing here, of the Minotaur who has like the engravings that are dyed on the horns. They have lots of really cool crafting and ideas. The thing that I think kind of rubs me the wrong way is they come off as a very overly pious, overly virtuous ancestry. They don't feel like a real ancestry, even though they do have a small teeny section that talks about how some who've had some negative experiences retreat into caves and defend them, to the death, which helps perpetuate the kind of vicious Minotaur kind of ideology. The majority, 90% of the text just makes them seem overly virtuous and overly cautious, and that just doesn't feel like a real ancestry. Like anyone, they should be just people, you know, they should be just people who are capable of flaws and all that other kinds of stuff. And the idea of putting a whole ancestry in this light that they are all trying to be so restrictive is, I mean, it doesn't feel like an actual ancestry. You know what I mean? Not that I want them to be monsters. I just want them to be portrayed like any other ancestry would, capable of both good and evil. That's just the thing. And while that is kind of the case, again, it's they overly emphasize how minotaurs are like misunderstood, which is, I don't know. I like the minotaurs personally. I think they're really cool. So let's go ahead and take a look at the stats, as I'm sure you guys are over the preamble. So starting out, they have 10 hit points, which is massive. That's a lot of base hit points, but obviously they are a large ancestry, so it makes a ton of sense. They also have a not a bad movement speed of 25 feet. Now, their core attributes are strength and constitution with an attribute flaw of charisma. The charisma is mostly represented by their misunderstood nature and people's perception of them more than it is actual Minotaur nature. And of course, they get the free boost as well with the flaw. And other than that, the one thing that I should mention, since this is the first video, is despite these ancestors, most of these ancestries having large, you know, the capability being large or just being large at base, they don't give you reach. So a Minotaur, despite being large, still can only hit adjacent squares unless they take another feat, which we'll get to here in a little bit. And that's the case for all the ancestries in this book. So don't misunderstand, they are large, but they don't have reach. Also, they're uncommon, so they're not very prevalent, and they're rather secluded, but I'm sure most GMs wouldn't have a problem with them. I honestly wouldn't personally. Now, if we look at some of their other traits here, we see they have dark vision, makes sense, they're a subterranean race, and they have horns, which is a pretty good attack. It's a D8 piercing attack that's in the brawling group and are unarmed. So they don't get anything special, but they do a lot of damage. Very, very good, and there's lots of ways that horns can be used, especially later in this book, which we'll get to in another video. Also, another thing I want to make special mention of is the ancestries here do offer a thing, and this is something I completely missed in player core because, well, I mean, all those ancestries I already knew about, but in the beliefs section here, they do have popular edicts and popular anathema that you can impose on your character and can play into your character as far as your champion if you want to take on some extra edicts and anathema. For the Minotaur, their popular edicts are to construct architecture of lasting beauty, seek out or even more perplexing puzzles, and hones one's prowess. And their anathema are leave fate to godly hands rather than mortal initiative, pass up the chance to investigate a mystery. And the anathema ties into the fact that due to their creation myth, the guy that they are descended from essentially was screwed over by the gods. So Minotaur don't tend to like praying to gods, mostly being spiritual in other ways, though they do have an appreciation for some of the more brainy gods or some of the more self-controlled gods like Aurori or Nethys. Along with along with every ancestry, we do have heritages, and I gotta say, the Minotaur heritages are pretty cool. First, we have the Ghost Bull Minotaur, which sounds really cool. And they have really cool art. You can actually see the art right here. But what they do is they get an innate occult cantrip, Know the Way, which, you know, a little on the nose, but that's just how it is. And as well, they get a +1 circumstance bonus to saves against spells or effects that cause the confused condition. So overall, not bad. Know the Way is a very handy cantrip, mostly early game, but there are some campaigns I'm sure it is very handy. Plus, I believe Ghost Bowl leads to some other future more spellcastery ancestry feats. So that being the case, it's honestly not a bad heritage. Next up, we have the Glacier Cavern Minotaur, and they just get a resistance to cold equal to half their level, and they treat all environmental cold effects as 1 level of extreme less. So yeah, not bad, just very standard. Very good for some types of campaigns for sure, and cold resistance is never a bad thing, but probably one of the least interesting ones in my opinion. Next up, we have the Little Horn Minotaur. I love this one. Mostly, it's just a medium-sized Minotaur, and their horn attack gets changed from a D8 to a D6, and it gains the Agile trait. So you can still use many of the later Minotaur horn features. It's just now your base horn attack is a little weaker, but is better for multi-attacking, and you're now a medium-sized creature if that's your preference, which I think is always cool to have. Next up, we have the Roaming Minotaur. You become trained in survival and you gain access to the terrain expertise skill. You also ignore the difficult terrain caused by natural uneven terrain in your given terrain expertise. So yeah, you kind of get a 2 for this one, honestly. You get essentially 2 skill feats worth, because I believe there's another feat, or maybe it's a ranger feature. I can't remember at this moment. It's not super important. You get terrain expertise, which gives you a bonus to survival in your particular terrain. And this also allows you to ignore difficult terrain caused by natural uneven ground while in your terrain. So pretty cool. Not anything super special in my opinion, but at least it offers you something. And in some types of campaigns, it can be really good. The Slab Soul Minotaur. Oh my goodness. This one in particular is very cool, and it leads to some very cool feats later on. So this one gives you access to essentially a kind of like a once per day spell. It's not a spell though, it's an effect where once per day you raise up stone slabs around you, and then they fall on all adjacent creatures. They need to make a basic reflex saving throw against your class or spell DC. So this one tends to favor the spellcastery ones, whichever is higher. And if they crit fail the check, they are knocked prone. The attack does 1d6 bludgeoning damage, but every odd level it increases by another d6. So at 3rd level, it will be 2d6, and at 5th level, it will be 3d6. Not bad. A once per day kind of earthbendery attack against all those adjacent to you. And, you know, you're a Minotaur, you're large, so there's a lot of adjacency to your character, which makes this one actually better. Slab Soul as a base feature is kind of cool, but I like it better for the feats that we're going to get to here in just a moment. Last but not least, we have the most terrifying heritage for the Minotaur, which is the Stalker Minotaur. Now, Minotaurs have this kind of perceived myth of being very quiet, being hard to detect due to, you know, small surface area of their hooves, and the fact that the Minotaur and the myths snuck up on people all the time adds a level of fear. The Stalker Minotaur leads to a very scary feat line for enemies, but essentially you become trained in stealth, and you gain the terrain Stalker feats, but it must be for rubble specifically. And when you do the stealthless move part of terrain Stalker, you can move 10 feet rather than 5 feet, which is pretty cool. That means that they can sneak up on a lot of people who are not aware a lot easier than other characters. And they're huge, which are large, you know. So that being the case, it makes for a very, very interesting heritage, and really good for a lot of playstyles, as it's not just rogues that make a lot of use of stealth. A lot of other character types can use stealth very well. So this type of Minotaur, I think, is going to be very popular. All right, let's go ahead and get to the feats, shall we? The video is already about 15 minutes long so far, a little bit less than that. So I'm going to try to bust these out, make this video not that long. First up, we have Artisanal Crafter. You get the crafting as a skill proficiency. If you're already trained in it, you get something else. And you gain specialty crafting, which you get your choice of blacksmithing, leatherworking, or stonemasonry. So pretty good. If you want to go crafting and you're not like an inventor, then this is a pretty solid one to pick up. Then we have a cattle speech. This is actually super common in this book because most of the Ancestries give you the ability to talk to creatures in some kind, and the Minotaur are no exception. They can talk to bovine or auroch, bison, even antelopes and cattle. So this allows you to talk to them using, simple questions. You can make a request of them using your diplomacy, and they're more likely to listen to what you say, even though I guess it's not what it says here. It says specifically, You can ask questions of, receive answers from, and use the diplomacy skill with cattle, bison, and antelopes, and other grazing mammals that travel in herds. The GM in the end gets to determine what animals count for this ability. So it's pretty good. I don't know how common it would be, but to be fair, I believe horses would count under this as well, which, I mean, the horses are like everywhere. So, and most beasts of burden kind of are in this same trend. So I actually, amongst many of them, I think this one's pretty solid. Continuing on with the Masonry trend, we have I for Masonry. You get a +2 circumstance bonus to perception checks to notice unusual stonework. This bonus applies to checks to discover mechanical traps made of stone or items hidden with stone, as well as secret doors made of stone. If it's made with stone, you get a +2 circumstance bonus to perceive it. Also, in addition, when you use athletics to force open a stone door or a thievery to disable a device made primarily of stone, you get a +1 circumstance bonus to that check. So pretty much if it's a stone thing, you have a +2 to perceive it better. And if it's a door that either needs to be picked or forced open, you get a +1 instead. So pretty good. Next up is a fun one. It's called Friendly Nudge. Now, it does require that you're trained in athletics, but when you do so, you attempt an athletics check to shove an ally that you're politely trying to move. You don't need to have a free hand to attempt this check, and if your ally is willing, you treat the result as 1 degree of success better. So what this really does is it makes it easier to move your allies and move yourself. I mean, a shove allows you to push after the target. And since you get 1 level of success better, you get 10 or more potential movement that moves both you and an ally. And the ally doesn't need to spend any extra actions, and you don't need a hand free to do this. Friendly Nudge is actually surprisingly really good in a lot of situations. And because you're a big Minotaur, I mean, this makes it very simple for you to push someone who is a little bit meeker out of the way so that you can come in and make, become their bodyguard, more or less. So I actually really like Friendly Nudge. Next up, we have Keen Nose. This gives you an imprecise sense of scent, I guess, up to a range of 30 feet. You also get a +1 status or circumstance bonus to fort saves against anything that has the olfactory effect that causes the sickened condition specifically. I don't know why sickened specifically. I could just see this being against any olfactory effect and still being just as, viable. Not very common, but viable. But unfortunately, this is only saves against olfactory effects that cause the sickened condition. Though, honestly, just having a imprecise sense of 30 feet and using anything really is very solid, and this does make it harder for enemies to avoid your perception unless they have some way of masking their scent. So Keen Nose is very solid. Next up, we have Minotaur Lore. This makes you trained in society and stealth. I love the stealth stuff. And you also you get the additional lore feat for Minotaur Lore. So as you level up, you just always know a lot about Minotaurs. Makes a lot of sense. The 2 skill proficiencies are pretty good. If none of the other level 1 feats really appeal to you, this is not a bad one to take. Next up, we have Minotaur Weapon Familiarity. This gives you access to and proficiency in, pretty much proficiency in, actually, now that I think about it, into battle axes, falchions, glaives, and great axes. And it doesn't state specifically weapons with the Minotaur traits, so there's this thing that I don't know what the intent is, and sometimes with these feats, I don't know. Sometimes they're not the same writer, so I don't know what their intent is. But for this one, it says, for the purpose of proficiency in these weapons, you treat the martial weapons as simple weapons. So, and since none of these are advanced weapons, I mean, that makes sense that they don't go down to martial. But since there's no Minotaur weapons with the Minotaur traits, I wonder if Ancestries that have a special trait with their weapons are only the Ancestry weapons get that reduced proficiency while you get access to everything else, or what. Honestly, it's very frustrating many times to get one of these kind of weapon familiarity feats and be like, oh, cool, I can equip, like on my alchemist, for instance, a great axe. For Minotaur, that works. But for like dwarf, that might not work because it would have to be a dwarf weapon that you get the reduced proficiency requirement for. So I don't know. In any regard, in the same line with the new changes to weapon familiarity feats, at level 5, you automatically get the benefits of the crit specialization effects for the weapons. And due to how the proficiency for this one works, you don't even need to worry about getting the improved version of proficiency, as if you are trained in simple weapons, which I think every class is trained in simple weapons, you just get access to all these weapons, which is really cool. So Minotaur Weapon Familiarity is an insanely good feat if you want your non-martial character to have access to some really good martial weapons, especially the glaive, as that seems to be a favored weapon amongst many kind of caster types of archetypes. So overall, I think this feat is really good. Next up is Pantheon Magic, which I find to be very interesting since they have an aversion to, divine stuff, but it does says a touch of divine meddling runs through you whether you want it to or not. So I guess it's fair. Anyway, you choose a divine cantrip to have access to. That's it. You just get a free divine cantrip that heightens automatically. And because it doesn't state here specifically, if you're not inherently a magic caster, you use your charisma for your spellcasting proficiency. So yeah, not bad. I think this one is pretty cool, and there are some really good like divine cantrips nowadays, so I think it's not a bad one. It used to not be a very good feat because divine just had really bad cantrips, but nowadays Pantheon Magic's probably a really solid feat, especially because I almost forgot, especially with Divine Mysteries and War of Immortals books coming out very soon. I guarantee we're probably going to see some more really cool divine cantrips. So that being the case, Pantheon Magic is really cool. All right, we hit the level 5 feats now, and we start off with the best one, Alarming Disappearance. Now, you do need to be an expert in stealth, but whenever you successfully hide when previously observed, creatures you are hidden from become frightened one, no save. They're then immune to this effect for an hour, but I absolutely love this because it just like, where'd the Minotaur go? And then a deep dread fills the enemies. It's really good. Now, this should probably have like the emotion trait or something because, I mean, technically enemies that don't have emotions can't be affected by such things like the frightened condition unless it specifies otherwise. But still, it would just be something that would make sense and help with a lot of traits and tags in the game. Regardless, I absolutely love this one. I think this is the best feat. Just the fact that the Minotaur suddenly disappears and everyone suddenly becomes frightened one with no save is pretty good. So Minotaur Rogue has a very strong place with this ancestry. It's really, really cool. Beast of Burden is a surprisingly really good feat as well. Now, this increases your bulk limit by 4. Now, you're already a large creature, so your bulk limit is pretty big. So I don't even know how necessary this one is for most people. And I'm sure a lot of tables ignore bulk. We actually play with bulk in my game, which is surprising because we cut off a lot of auxiliary systems similar to this one. So this one for our group is actually pretty solid, but even better, you can rest normally while wearing medium armor. So it's only medium armor, which is very interesting. Now, most armors have the comfortable tag or the comfy tag, so you can rest in most light armors nowadays. But medium armors, this is definitely very interesting. Sucks that it's not also heavy armors, but I guess we need reasons for the heavy armor like archetypes and classes with potentially the Guardian and the Commander getting similar feats. So overall, not bad. Really like this one, and being able to rest in your armor is a pretty solid benefit, so it makes being attacked while you're camping less egregious. So overall, Beast of Burden's actually pretty good. Next feat is Labyrinthine Echoes. I like the theme is behind this one, but I don't like the application because all this one does is it gives you access to ventriloquism once per day, and at 7th level, the spell is heightened to 2nd rank. Ventriloquism is okay and definitely can be used in some very interesting ways, but it's a spell particularly you have to work really hard to get a lot of good use out of rather than a lot of other spells. I like the ideas behind this one. I think theming wise, Labyrinthine Echoes is interesting, and there's probably some interesting things you could do with this one. It's just not one of my favorite spells, so being that as it may, your mileage on this one may vary. Natural Orienteering, which is a weird word. I didn't even know Orienteering was a word, but anyway, whenever you roll a survival check to sense direction or track, you get a critical success when you roll a success. So that's potentially really good. It makes Minotaur Rangers who are specifying or like specializing in tracking insanely good because you get the crit specialization and as well sense direction. It's very hard for you to lose your sense of direction. So Minotaur makes a ton of sense. Can be helpful in some situations, I'm sure. It really just depends on how often you're playing in games where your characters can potentially get lost. So that being the case, this one is very interesting. It's useful for a very niche set of characters, but if you're that niche character, this almost becomes mandatory. Puzzle Solver. This is actually a really good one. So once per hour, when you attempt a recall knowledge check about a subject or creature, you gain a +1 circumstance bonus to your next skill check regarding the creature or subject, even if you didn't succeed the recall knowledge. And this bonus increases to +2 if you're a master in the skill used to recall knowledge. So when you recall knowledge, which there's so many classes, especially soon, who are really just focused on recall knowledge, like the thaumateurs especially, who even if you fail, you get a +1 circumstance bonus on your next skill check. So if you're going to trip the enemy or use some kind of athletics maneuver or feint the enemy, really good. And if you're a master in this skill, which you just need to be level 7 to get to, you get a +2 to this check instead. It's a very solid one, and there's so many ways you can intermix recall knowledge into your kits nowadays, which makes Puzzle Solver actually a really good benefit for anyone who likes using maneuvers or special kind of skill abilities on enemies. And the final level 5 feat here is Stretching Reach. Now, this was a very weird one because essentially, when you're wielding a melee weapon that requires 2 hands and doesn't have reach already, you can change the way you place your hands, I guess, essentially, as an action to stretch your reach, giving you reach with that weapon. Weapons wielded in your extended reach gain a reach of 10 feet, which is really good. So the thing is this just seems like a lot of extra words. Essentially, if you're wielding a 2-handed weapon that doesn't have reach, it can have reach. It says here that you need to use an interact action to get the extended reach. So I don't know if the intent behind this is if you start combat, you need to extend your reach using an action, which seems kind of lame. I don't know why we can't just start off in the extended reach. If it was up to me, and probably how I'll run it is when you're wielding a weapon with 2 hands, it just now has reach. Plain and simple. It doesn't need to be much more than that. The extra action, I think, is just kind of a overly balancing feature. And if you're a GM who's concerned about Minotaurs just getting reach through a feat, which I don't know why you would, because it's the same as using a spell, honestly, then you can impose that it's kind of like a stance in the sense that they don't start combat with it and they need to use an action to essentially get the extended reach with their weapon. So however you prefer, I'm not going to be too fussed about it. What I like about this one is 2-handed weapons, and it has to be 2-handed weapons specifically, gain reach, which, I think is pretty fair and balanced. All right, now to the level 9 feats, ancestry feats. We have Friendly Fling, a really fun one. And what this one does is as long as you're adjacent to an ally for 2 actions, you can pick up the ally and toss them 20 feet. They don't take damage from the fall or anything in this way. And this movement doesn't trigger any reactions as it's force movement. I guess it doesn't count as force movement, even though it kind of works as force movement. Your ally's movement doesn't trigger reactions, regardless. So 20 feet, you toss them. Your ally ends their movement on their feet. They don't land prone, and they don't take damage from this, but they do take a d6 piercing damage from your horns, which is okay, I guess. I guess that's fair and balanced. If your ally ends this movement within melee reach of at least one enemy, they can make a melee strike against an enemy within their reach as a reaction. So Friendly Fling is really good. And hey, if you're the short Minotaur, you can still do this because it doesn't require you to be large. So you fling your ally, they go 20 feet. They do take a d6, but they can then use a reaction to attack someone. So if they don't have reactive strike, which, you know, there's a lot of martials who don't innately have it anyway, this is a really good way to squeeze out an attack during the reaction. It does cost 2 of your actions. So, you know, this is something I would do mostly if you're playing a more support character and you're not like casting a spell. Like really good for summoner. A summoner Minotaur, I think, can really make good use out of Friendly Fling, as you could probably even do this with your own island, which is pretty cool. So overall, Friendly Fling is really fun. Next up, we have a Goring Charge. This is a very interesting one, and not the only charge feat here in this book, though it's the only one, I think, for the Minotaur. Essentially, what happens is it's 2 actions. You stride twice, and then you can strike a foe that you end adjacent to. If you moved at least 20 feet from your starting position, your Horn Strike also deals a d6 persistent bleed damage. And oh, I guess I should mention, it's 2 strides, and then you can make a strike with your horn attack specifically. So not your weapons, which is fine. And if you moved at least 20 feet, it does the additional d6 persistent bleed damage, which is really good. Goring Charge, I think, is a really good combat initiator, as oftentimes that's the most likely time you're 20 feet away from an enemy anyway, if you're a frontliner. Lets you run in, gore the enemy. If you're using Hand Wraps of Mighty Blows, your horns probably do not a bad amount of damage, and then they start taking persistent bleed damage, and then you can make a second strike if you feel confident in hitting that second strike. So Goring Charge, I think, is really good. Siphon Torment kind of goes into the whole woe is the Minotaurs. We've suffered a lot from curses in the past. It's a good feat. I just, you know, they seem just overly tragic, if you ask me personally. Anyway, Siphon Torment is really cool. Once per day, you can cast Claim Curse, which allows you to take a curse onto yourself as a innate divine spell. And when you do so, the target creature that you claim the curse from gains temporary hit points equal to your levels. So overall, a really good one. Very great for making sure that an ally who's very vital to your team composition is able to not only not be affected by a terrible curse, but to also get some temporary HP. Really good for support characters, if you ask me personally. So I actually really do like this one, despite my grumblings earlier. Stone Passage. This one's really cool. Now, you do need to be a Slab Soul Minotaur to get this one, and you can only use it once per hour, but that's fine, because for 2 actions, you can stride up to your speed, and you can move through stone and rock objects, such as walls, as if they were unoccupied spaces. Now, if you do end your movement in one of these squares that you normally would not be able to pass through, you're thrown back to the last unoccupied square you moved into. So this is really cool. You can just walk through walls once per hour as a Minotaur. That's terrifying. I find this feat very cool, very fun, and can be used in a lot of ways. And unlike a lot of other like pass through stone kind of features, this one technically can work on worked stone, as it mentions walls specifically. So yeah, I don't know how your knowledge of stonework can help, but it does has inherent magic. So, you know, I guess it does make sense magic is involved. But Stone Passage is an incredibly solid feat for the Slab Soul Minotaurs. All right, on to level 13, we have Phantom Charm. Now, this is a free action. This one does require you to be a Ghost Bowl Minotaur Heritage, and similarly, you can use this one once per day. Now, the trigger for this free action is when you attempt a check that would be subject to a misfortune effect. So any checks around a misfortune effect of any kind, you negate the misfortune effect, and you gain a +2 circumstance bonus to the triggering check. Now, this is actually something that's becoming a bit more common, as there's a lot more fortune and misfortune things that were kind of added during Dark Archive. So I actually do anticipate Phantom Charm to actually be a feat worth considering taking, as many misfortune effects can just utterly destroy like an attack roll or any kind of skill check that you're attempting to do. So Phantom Charm is a really good way to ensure that enemies can't mess with your attacks, which I think is very solid. Next up, we have Shift the Little Ones, another fun one. And of course, this is in the feat line of Friendly Nudge, so you do need to have Friendly Nudge and be an expert in athletics. And what this one does is it essentially just enhances your stride action. So when you use this one, you stride up to your speed. If you end your movement in a position where one or more of your spaces are occupied by an ally, each of those allies can immediately step as a free action, not a reaction, which is pretty big, so that they're no longer occupying a space you're in. If you move and they can't possibly move out of it, then the move is canceled. Shift the little ones is really good because essentially it just makes your stride better, because if your stride would end in an ally square, they can just move out of your space as a free action. Really good for repositioning if allies are in a particularly bad situation. And it just, like I said, it's just an enhanced stride. There's nothing else. It just makes your stride better, which I think is really cool. Now, it is only with stride, so this can't be used with other forms of movement, but still, it's pretty solid. Threatening Pursuits. This is an interesting one as well. It's a singular action. You do need to be an expert in both intimidation and stealth, so another one of the stealth lines of feats, which is really fun. And it has a requirement that you're not observed by any enemies within 60 feet. So again, stealth rogue, Minotaur, very potentially a lot of fun with this one. So what happens is you attempt an intimidation check to demoralize all enemies within 30 feet, and you do not take a penalty for not sharing a language with this one. If the targets are in a maze or similarly difficult to navigate location, you get a +2 bonus circumstance to this check, and the range increases to 60 feet. Each target is then temporarily immune for an hour. The most practical use of this one is you're a Minotaur. You are sneaking up on a combat and you're not observed currently. And then you just start off the combat with doing a demoralize on all enemies within 30 feet. And yeah. Now, if you're in like mists, there's also ways where like a misty terrain that's easy to get lost in can also benefit from this one. And it increases your range crazy high. Also, if you're indoors, as long as they can hear you shouting, you can do this like around corners in a maze or similar like structure. So that being the case, I think Threatening Pursuit is actually a lot of fun, very cool, and a very strong way to start off combat if you're going the stealth Minotaur route. All right, we're down to the last couple of feats. We have for level 17, we have Begin Stampede. Now, this is a big 3-action activity, but it's pretty cool. You stride up to twice your speed, and you make a horns melee attack. If your strike hits and damages an enemy, each ally within 60 feet who saw you hit can use a reaction to stride up to twice their speed, but each must end their stride closer to you than where they started. Each such ally then that strides get a +1 status bonus on their first strike on their next turn. So Begin Stampede is essentially the I'm going to charge in first. You go in, you stride up to twice and make a strike. This doesn't really have a lot of action efficiency for you, as it's 2 strides and a strike, so there's nothing to be gained. But if you do this, your allies can stride twice. Yeah, twice their speed, essentially. Not 2 strides, but twice their speed. Makes a difference. As a reaction, and then their next strike gets a +1, which is a really good initiating tool. This is very solid for any kind of Minotaur who want to lead the charge into big combats, and if you have a team with a lot of decent martial characters. So overall, Begin Stampede is really, really good in full martial team setups. And last but not least, we have Into the Labyrinth, which once per day you can cast Quandary, which I think is the spell that replaced Maze as an 8th rank occult innate spell, which is weird that it's not divine since all the other ones have been divine. Oh well. Which takes the form of a labyrinth instead of a puzzle room. Targets cannot attempt to use occultism to escape this spell. Rather, they can use survival to find their way out through the labyrinth. So essentially, level 17, you can conjure your own labyrinth for people to try to find their way out of. Very solid, very powerful spell, and if you're not taking Begin Stampede, there's no reason not to take Into the Labyrinth. It's really good. I would say there's not many other feats in this list that I would say compares. So yeah, that's going to be it for the Minotaur. It's definitely a very strong ancestry. I'm glad we started off with this one. tomorrow we're going to be taking a look at one of the new archetypes, specifically the Were Creature archetype. So stay tuned, subscribe so that you'll see these videos when they pop up. But that's going to be it for me. Thank you all so much for watching. Good luck with your games. Leave the bad luck to me, and I'll see y'all tomorrow. Bye.